Welcome to the Point. During the month of August, we will feature each of the members of the United States House of Representatives that represent West Michigan. There are 4 members, 1 Democrat, Hillary Scholten, who was our guest last week, and 3 Republicans. Between all 4 Congress members, they cover roughly all or part of 30 or more counties, and their responsibility goes beyond West Michigan in some cases, but they all still represent part of our coverage area. This week, we talked with Congressman John Molinar. His 2nd district goes from north of Cadillac to south of Hastings and from the Lake Shore to east of Mount Pleasant before tapering off to cover Portland and Greenville and parts of Kent County. This is a new district for Moolenaar, but he's been serving in the U.S. House since first being elected in 2014. He previously served in the Michigan State House and Senate. We talked with him about an unusual session so far this year and what he sees as some of the pressing issues that lie ahead. Congressman, let's talk about this session. Last time you were here, you had just gotten organized, and Republicans had a little bit of trouble coming up with some leadership, but then it kind of was set up that way from the get-go because it was such a narrow majority, and there are different opinions within your party, just as there are in the Democratic Party, but in the Republican Party, they may be a little more pronounced these days. Right. What's it been like to get this group of Republicans together and try to have some impact in Washington?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's good to have the majority, and it did take us a little while to select a speaker, and as you point out, there's a lot of different opinions and a process that we went through. I think we came through it stronger because of it, because a lot of the concerns about rules or how legislation would be taken up were addressed during that process. So I think we're going to be more of a functioning majority, and I think we're already seeing that with the legislation that we've been able to pass, but we have a slim majority. We can only lose on any day between 4 and 5 Republican votes.
And then you have an uphill battle once it goes to the Senate because you don't have the majority there. And down on Pennsylvania Avenue, you don't necessarily have a willing partner. So, I mean, it is kind of an uphill fight, but still it is the only branch where Republicans have a majority. So it's your one place to kind of make a stand, right?
That's right. It's a place where we can show how Republicans govern. We've been able to advance a number of different policies that are going to help families, secure the border, help our economy, make sure we're energy independent. But some of those then stall in the Senate, and there's a contrast between what we're doing and what the White House is doing. So sometimes we're playing defense, sometimes we're on offense and just demonstrating how Republicans govern. Ultimately, though, we have a lot of responsibility for oversight, investigations, and these are things that we can do now in the majority.
And you are. There are any number of investigations underway. Let's talk a little bit about that process, because one of the things that Congress is charged with is coming up with a spending plan and getting budgets passed. Now, continuing resolutions instead of full-blown budget deals have seemed to be the norm over the past number of decades. Still, I know that you're talking about spending. Where are we on a budget when you head back to Washington in September?
Well, as you know, Rick, I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and that's the committee that's in charge of the spending bills. We have 12 different appropriations bills that fund the federal government. We've passed 10 of those 12s out of committee, so we are making significant progress on those bills. We actually have reduced spending to the 2022 levels because what we recognize is the massive overspending that's been taking place these last few years has really driven inflation, and that's making it so that people's paychecks don't go as far as they used to, whether it's for gas or groceries. And so we wanted to limit spending, and we've been able to do that with those bills. The Appropriations Committee also has the responsibility of overseeing different agencies and departments and making sure that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely. But to your question, where we are in the process right now, we don't want to have a continuing resolution because what that is basically let's keep the current spending plan as is in place. That really hurts innovation. It hurts our defense because it funds last year's priorities, if you will. So we want to make sure we're getting our work done, but it's going to require us to be successful working with the Senate as well as the President.
One place where an appropriations bill, and it's a big one, the National Defense Appropriations, passed in the House. After it got out of committee, there were some amendments put on that bill. It passed. It went to the Senate. The Senate did not concur. They came up with another plan. And so now you've got to come to some kind of a consensus. Where are we going to be with that? Because I think a lot of people look at that as kind of a litmus test, because most people in Congress would agree that's one of the most important funding issues that there is.
Sure. Well, the National Defense Authorization Act is crucial, and we need to pass that. As you mentioned, there are different versions in the House and in the Senate, and what happens there is it goes to a conference committee where those differences are ironed out with input from the executive branch, and hopefully we will have a bill that funds our military, gives them the resources they need, hopefully a pay raise for our troops, because we need to do that. And then secondly, we need to make sure we're focusing on the right things. We want to make sure our war fighters, our defense are actually aimed at defending our country and making sure we're competitive and strength, peace through strength, if you will.
One of the things that I know you do in your work on the committee that is looking at activities of China and Chinese companies is you also get an assessment of their military prowess and activity. And a former member of the U.S. House, Mike Rogers, raised the alarm earlier this year about China's relative strength compared to ours militarily, even so far as having more ships than perhaps the U.S. military does for the first time in maybe forever. Is that part of this act too, is to make sure that we're keeping up with what could be potential threats?
I believe that the threat we face from China, the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army, is the most significant threat we will face in the next few decades, because ultimately they are trying to be dominant, whether it comes to the military, and as you point out, their shipbuilding and their Navy is the largest in the world. The way they're threatening any potential adversaries, or even just simply seeking to dominate the seas, whether it's the South China Seas, whether it's the threats to Taiwan, all around the world they are threatening. We've even seen situations where their ships have come within 150 yards of our ships, just in these reckless provocations, and spy balloons, hacking, espionage, you name it. So it's a significant threat, and the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is a big part of curbing that threat.
We're going to come back to that, particularly the espionage part. We're also going to talk a little bit more about that battery plant that is being proposed to be built in your district, but something else, and that is supply chain. You met with U.S. automakers in Detroit back in June, July, somewhere along in there. And you talked with them a little bit, again, through your activities on the Chinese committee. What did you hear from automakers when it comes to supply chain and how dependent they are, particularly on China?
Well, first we have to recognize that they are in an environment, a competitive environment, and we have an EPA that through their mandates is forcing the direction of our auto companies. And basically through these mandates, they're saying that by 2032, 2/3 of the cars on the road need to be electric vehicles. So what that's forcing these auto companies to do is to purchase technology and become more dependent on the Chinese Communist Party affiliated businesses. China is now the largest exporter of automobiles around the world, and they have a dominant position when it comes to battery technology, as well as the materials that are used to make those batteries. And unfortunately, we've ceded that to them because we actually developed the technology at American universities, American companies, and then the Chinese bought it, and now we're leasing it back from them, if you can believe that.
I want to go back to something you said. What percentage of cars on the road by 2032?
2/3, 66%.
In 9 years.
In 9 years.
Did the automakers think that's possible, or did they express any idea one way or the other?
I think they are concerned about, this regulation. They believe that this is the wave of the future, and they are trying to comply with this, but they are making decisions in the short term because of it and becoming further dependent on Chinese supply chains. And a better approach would be to let the market decide, let customers choose what vehicles they want to purchase, and then the automakers could innovate, and maybe we'd be ahead of China when it comes to battery technology or other technologies, rather than simply leasing back technology that we developed decades ago.
When we come back, more about that battery plant currently under development in Congressman Molinar's district and why he thinks it's a bad idea. Plus, his take on the nation's budget talks. Will they actually get a spending plan in Washington, or just another continuing resolution? You'll hear about that next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. In the world of partisan politics, getting things done isn't always easy, somewhat by design. While many issues are dealt with in a bipartisan manner in the House and Senate, it's the big things that tend to bog Congress down. While there are other big fights on any number of subjects during almost every session, the one guaranteed fight will be over the budget. It appears to be on track to be another bruising battle this year. As an appropriator, Congressman Molinar will talk about that, but first he weighs in on that battery plant near Big Rapids that has created controversy and some political fallout. The last time you were here, we were talking about that battery plant that's being built near Big Rapids, or is being proposed to be built. And earlier this month, Goshen, the company that is proposing to build that plant, said they finalized the purchase deal on 270 acres in that area. You are opposed to that idea, as are many constituents up there, although there are certainly those that are in favor of it, including some elected township officials, I think. And I read, and only partially read, the idea that there may even be some recalls in the making because of this. This has become quite the issue up there. Tell me from your standpoint, you've been there and you've talked to these folks. From your standpoint, why is this a bad idea? And for those people who are trying to get this done, how do they try to convince you it's a good idea?
Sure. Well, you know, when you think about it, any type of investment in your district where it's creating jobs would normally be something you'd be very excited about. And when I first heard about the investment, you know, like many, I was like, wow, that's great. But the more you find out about it, the ownership of the company, the parent company, Goshen High Tech, is based in China, and in their Articles of Association actually has a dependence on the Chinese Communist Party, that there has to be an allegiance and to promote the activities of the Chinese Communist Party. So even though there's an American subsidiary, the parent company is based in China. Why is that a concern? Because really there is no difference in China between the private sector, there is not a private sector, and the Chinese Communist Party, and then their influences. So in effect, they have a military civil fusion where any private sector or business activity, innovation, ultimately can be used for military applications, and all the information has to be given to the Chinese Communist Party. So anytime you're talking about this kind of an investment in the United States, we are risking losing our technology, but also opening ourselves up to the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. This is over less than 100 miles from Camp Grayling, where, as the Wall Street Journal has reported, we are actually training different military leaders of different companies, including Taiwan, which may be invaded by the Chinese.
I want to read you some headlines. These all came from your press shop. Moolenaar, when will Michigan and Green Township do the right thing? In case you missed it, former counterintelligence official testifies CCP will use subsidiary for espionage. Latest CCP cyber attack should concern Michigan leaders. I mean, this is obviously something that you've been pretty invested in. Again, with your position on this Chinese committee, how concerned are you that a facility like this would be used for espionage? And if it is, what can you do about it?
Well, there's no question that the CCP will try to leverage an investment like this for their purposes, to get information, to try and gain as much information as they can. And anyone who works there, anyone who has an affiliation with those companies is going to be at risk for leverage. So sometimes people say, well, are you being anti-Chinese? No, the people who are abused the most by the Chinese Communist Party are the Chinese people and the Chinese diaspora. So they have police stations in New York City that are spying, that are threatening, intimidating the Chinese diaspora in New York City. Anytime you have a situation like that where there's leverage that the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's hacking information, whether it's espionage, they will use that for their purposes, and we just have to recognize that as a reality. And so when the counter-intelligence expert testify, he's 100% confident they will try and leverage that. It's based on the experience he's had around the world.
Well, what do you do about this? The state's made a big pledge for investment in this company. This company's already pledged to buy the 270 acres. Township has signed off on it. And is there anything else that can be done other than try to protect against the concerns that you've raised?
Well, I think that the local officials will have a final say on this. I would say we are where we are at this point. As you mentioned, there are some recall efforts going on. Ultimately, you never want to look at someone and disparage anyone because ultimately we're looking at behaviors and guarding against unlawful behaviors. And that's going to be the key when it comes to this, to be vigilant, to be clear-eyed about the leverage that will be exerted by the parent company based in China, and just recognize we're going to have to be vigilant if it goes through. If it doesn't go through, I think our state of Michigan would be better served not to have an economic development strategy that furthers our dependence on the Chinese Communist Party.
I'm going to shift gears to another part of the world, and this is Israel. You recently reaffirmed your support as the country, as a country we did reaffirm support for Israel. The president of Israel spoke to Congress. In that country right now, they have some serious, and have had since earlier in the spring, some real protest and some real upheaval over some rules that involve the Supreme Court and some new rules that would change the judiciary there, without getting into all of that, because that's their business. Where are we with Israel, and where are they? I mean, how much did you hear about that political strife that's going on there?
Sure. Well, when the president came, he did talk about that. He mentioned that they are working through this to make sure there's an independent judiciary. In this country, we benefit from having checks and balances between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. They're working through that. You know, their process is different than ours. And as you mentioned, you know, we don't want to interfere in the workings of their government, but clearly they have benefited from being a democratic nation, and having an independent judiciary that respects the rule of law is very important to that. So I hope they're able to work through all this. It's a process. You know, they have a process where it took them a long time to elect a prime minister that has been able to stay in place for a while as well. So, you know, they're going through differences, and hopefully they'll come through it, but continue to have an independent judiciary and respect the rule of law.
We spent a good section of this show talking about two other foreign countries, and it brings to mind the multifaceted job that you have as a member of Congress. At once, you have your 20-some county area that you have to take care of, specialty crops, battery factory proposals, and all those kind of things. And on the other hand, you also kind of have to keep a little bit of a pulse on China, on Israel, and on other parts in the world where both our friends and potential adversaries. How much time do you spend working on the foreign component of that versus the stuff here at home?
Well, most of my work has been in the area of representing my constituents, the 2nd District, and looking out for our national interests, a lot of it being more the domestic policy. So as you point out, agriculture is very big in the 2nd District. tourism is big, manufacturing. You know, it's a great district. Now, the issue of China is partially because I was appointed by Speaker McCarthy to serve on this select committee on China, because he views this as the defining relationship in the coming decades. And I agree with that. I think for 30 years, you know, we viewed China that if we were simply trading with them, working with them, they'd become more democratic, more open, more free, less oppressive. Reality has been just the opposite. More autocratic, you know, oppressing the Uyghur Muslims and other religious minorities, and stealing our technology, and then building a huge national arsenal that can be a risk around the world. So this select committee is highly focused on raising these issues, helping to educate the American people, and working on legislation that will to put this relationship in the right context going forward, because quite frankly, they've taken a lot of advantage of us and our goodwill, and we've made some mistakes in that.
Back to agriculture for a minute, because I was just reminded that you recently have gotten some appropriations for agriculture in West Michigan. Tell me a little bit about that in the moments we have remaining in the show.
Well, one thing I've worked on is, you know, in Kent County, there's a new agricultural center in Lowell area. The Kent County Fair will be held there each year, and we were able to put in our appropriations bill $2 million to advance those efforts. You know, when I think of the importance of 4-H, when you get young people involved in agriculture and sort of the rural-urban understanding of how our food is grown, to me that's really important. And to see that new facility going up, it's very exciting.
What is the prospect, as we wrap this up, what is the prospect from your standpoint as an appropriator with a Democratic Senate and Democratic President, that Republicans in the House, Democrats in the Senate, and the President can come together on a spending plan, or will we come down to October and see a continuing resolution?
You know, my gut feeling is that we will come down to October, have a continuing resolution until people get to their final negotiated places. And my hope is that it will be as short term as possible, because I don't think a continuing resolution is in our national interest. Neither is an omnibus bill that no one's read, that people try and pass, you know, in the wee hours of the morning. We should go through the regular order of passing our appropriations bills, negotiating each one of those between the House and the Senate, and then finalizing it. We're a ways from that, and I'm hoping we can get there, but deadlines are approaching, and it's going to take people really of goodwill working together to solve problems.
When Congress returns in September, you'll begin to hear a lot about the budget. Democrats and Republicans have very different ideas about spending, and it will inevitably lead to a showdown over the House spending plan developed by Republicans and the Senate plan fashioned by majority Democrats. All that, whatever they pass, the president still has to sign off on the idea. It's something to watch going forward. Next week, my guest will be Congressman Bill Huizenga. To the point.